They never imagined a piece of paper could carry the weight of a lifetime. Eleanor Holloway held the envelope carefully, her fingers trembling despite herself. The handwriting was familiar, precise, deliberate, a voice from the past that refused to stay silent. Jonathan Holloway took it into his hands, with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The words inside would open old wounds, and the Holloways had long tried to forget the life they had shattered. Samuel, their eldest, noticed the tension immediately. He leaned forward, trying to read the words over his father's shoulder. But Jonathan's eyes narrowed as if warning him to stop. Eleanor felt a coldness in her chest. She had seen this handwriting before. Thomas Reed, the young man who had trusted the Holloways completely, only to have that trust destroyed. They had buried the man, yes, but the past does not rest easily when injustice lingers. Jonathan unfolded the letter slowly, and every syllable seemed to echo in the room. "You buried me, yet I cannot rest. Some debts are not paid with silence. The truth has eyes, and it will find its way." He did not speak. His mind replayed moments he had long tried to forget. Thomas working in the fields, always polite, always willing to help, and then the accusations that had turned the town against him. Jonathan had chosen the easiest path, protecting the family name, abandoning the truth. Eleanor had kept silent, complicit in the act, and now those choices confronted them in ink, clear and unyielding. Another letter arrived before anyone had a chance to digest the first. It was the same yellowed paper, the same careful handwriting. Eleanor's hands shook as she handed it to Jonathan. This one carried details, cruel moments Jonathan had forced upon Thomas, the whispers to neighbors, the shame imposed so that their own reputation remained untarnished. Each word cut deeper than the last, forcing memories and guilt to surface. Samuel read aloud, though his voice trembled. Each sentence revealed not just past actions, but the weight of conscience long denied. Eleanor watched her husband struggle with emotions he had never allowed himself to feel. Clara, the youngest, lingered at the edge of the room, sensing the shift in the air, the invisible weight of deeds long concealed. The Holloways attempted normal tasks, feeding animals, repairing fences, preparing meals, but everything felt hollow, each movement shadowed by the letter's presence. The first envelope had unsettled them. The second made it impossible to ignore the reckoning. Eleanor felt as if Thomas Reed's gaze followed them, silent but accusing even in his absence. The third envelope arrived that evening, with no return markings, no hint of how it had traveled to them. Jonathan's hands clenched the paper. The words recounted their cruelty in stark detail. The barn where Thomas had been forced to work despite illness. The rumors spread to the town to cover Jonathan's pride, the loneliness imposed upon the young man during his final days. The letter was not threatening, but the moral weight it carried pressed down upon every member of the family. Eleanor shivered. Samuel read parts aloud, forcing them all to confront what they had done. They had not merely buried a man. They had buried conscience, honesty, and trust along with him. The letters demanded acknowledgement, reflection, and remorse. Each phrase was a mirror reflecting the truth the family had tried to hide. Clara's voice broke the silence. "Mother, father, is he angry?" Eleanor shook her head, though her lips betrayed her fear. "He only wants the truth to be remembered," she said gently. The letters did not demand revenge. They demanded conscience. They demanded recognition of cruelty long denied, forcing the family to face the consequences of pride, deception, and silence. Each member felt it differently. Jonathan with the weight of decisions he had once believed necessary, Eleanor with the quiet torment of complicity, Samuel with a growing sense that the life they had preserved was built upon injustice, and Clara with an innocence that made the contrast all the sharper. Through the following days, envelopes continued to arrive. Each one revealed another layer of past wrongdoing, moments where Thomas had been forced into hard labor without rest, details of how he had been shunned and mocked by neighbors because of whispered lies, the solitude he had endured during his final months. Every word pierced the family's carefully maintained facade. The house, once orderly and quiet, now felt suffocating. Walls that had protected Them from public scrutiny could not. Shelter them from conscience. Eleanor found herself pausing in her chores, unable to continue until she reread passages of the letters, each time feeling more of the weight she had ignored for years. Jonathan walked the fields at irregular intervals, stopping near the places where Thomas had once worked, unable to confront the memories, but unable to escape them either. Samuel avoided the letters at first, but curiosity and growing unease drew him back repeatedly, each reading leaving him more shaken. Even Clara, though too young to fully understand, noticed the tension in every word spoken, every glance exchanged between her parents and brother. She asked questions quietly, noticing the silence that followed answers, and Eleanor's heart tightened each time she responded with careful restraint. The letters did not repeat themselves. Each arrived with new details, new recollections, each one unfolding another cruel choice the family had made. They were meticulous, deliberate, forcing reflection at every turn. Each member of the household was confronted not by threats, but by the weight of truth and the undeniable evidence of their own wrongdoing. By the end of the first week, the Halloways understood that these letters were not mere reminders. They were reckoning incarnate. They had once buried a man, yes, but they had buried his dignity, his hope, and now they were forced to see the consequences. Every act of self-interest, every lie to maintain appearances, returned to them sharper than any blade. No words could lessen the effect. No rationalizations could protect them from the conscience that Thomas Reed's letters had resurrected. The family sat together one evening, each holding a letter, each reading quietly, listening to the other's breathing, realizing that the life they had preserved had been built upon cruelty. And now the weight of that cruelty demanded recognition, reflection, and a reckoning that could not be ignored. The Halloways had learned a harsh truth. Some debts are never buried, and some wrongs are never forgotten. The letters ensured that every cruelty, every act of self-preservation at another's expense would be known and felt. For Jonathan, Eleanor, Samuel, and even young Clara, the past had returned in ink, deliberate, unyielding, and impossible to dismiss. No fire, no walls, no distance could contain it. The letters had become the measure of conscience, the reminder of every choice they had made to preserve pride over truth, reputation over justice. And the Halloways realized, with a gravity they could not escape, that nothing would ever feel the same again. The next envelope appeared on the worn doorstep as if it had been waiting for them all along. Eleanor's hands trembled as she carried it inside, the familiar, careful handwriting immediately setting her heart racing. Jonathan felt a tightening in his chest, a cold, creeping tension that refused to fade. Samuel lingered near the doorway, hesitant yet drawn, curiosity battling unease. Each letter from Thomas Reed had already unsettled them, but this one seemed to pulse with a quiet insistence, demanding attention and reflection in a way that was impossible to ignore. Jonathan broke the seal and unfolded the paper, scanning the words with a mixture of dread and a compulsive need to understand. Unlike the previous letters, this one detailed moments of subtle cruelty and overlooked negligence that had once seemed inconsequential. It described the heavy tasks Thomas had been made to complete while ill, the silent contempt with which his requests for help had been met, and the whispered judgments passed by the Halloways to maintain their public image. Every line was precise, deliberate, and imbued with a weight that forced the family to confront the reality of their actions. Eleanor read alongside him, feeling the familiar churn of guilt rising within her. She had long told herself that those moments had been necessary for farm management, that strictness and discipline were essential. Now each justification felt hollow, each memory tainted by the realization of harm done. The letter revealed not only their actions, but the cumulative effect of their indifference, showing how small cruelties had compounded into lasting suffering. Samuel's voice trembled as he read aloud a passage. It spoke of Thomas's isolation, the way he had been forced to work long hours without acknowledgement, and the subtle ways the family had prioritized reputation over compassion. The impact was immediate. The house seemed to contract around them, the air heavy with the presence of unspoken guilt. Clara, observing quietly from the hallway, noticed the tension and asked tentative questions, which Eleanor answered carefully. Knowing that some truths were too sharp even for a child to handle fully, Jonathan's hands tightened around the letter. The words described episodes of unfair punishment, moments when Thomas had been blamed for errors he did not commit, and the silent pressures that had left him isolated. Each sentence forced a confrontation with decisions long rationalized. The Halloways could no longer hide behind memory or selective forgetting. The letters demanded acknowledgement, demanding that they see their actions with clarity and honesty. Helena paused mid-task, her hands frozen over the laundry she had been sorting. Every fold reminded her of Thomas's quiet efforts, the respect he had shown despite the indifference and cruelty he endured. Jonathan, too, found the farm work unbearable. He could not walk past the barn without recalling the labor Thomas had performed under impossible conditions. Samuel, despite his youth, began to understand the depth of his parents' choices, realizing that the veneer of propriety had been bought at a steep human cost. Another letter arrived that evening, left carefully on the kitchen table. This one was more detailed, recounting specific incidents where Thomas had been forced to endure harsh treatment, moments when kindness could have altered outcomes, but was withheld. The letters did not seek vengeance. They simply documented facts, exposing truths that could no longer be ignored. Each revelation amplified the weight of memory and guilt, forcing the family to confront what they had once overlooked. Eleanor read passages aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Each line highlighted acts of neglect and the subtle prioritization of self-interest, demanding moral reckoning. Jonathan absorbed the words silently, though his jaw tightened with the realization that his own pride had led to sustained suffering. Samuel and Clara listened carefully, the household thick with tension. Every creak of the floorboards or flicker of the candlelight reminding them of the presence of accountability. The letters became a lens through which the family examined themselves. Tasks once mundane now carried weight. Conversations were measured, pauses loaded with reflection. Jonathan could no longer pass certain areas of the house without recalling incidents described in the letters. Eleanor's work slowed as she reread passages repeatedly, absorbing details she had long ignored. Samuel's curiosity was tempered by caution, each line deepening his understanding of the moral consequences of choices made by those he trusted. Clara, though young, sensed the shift, the tension between what had been done and the weight of acknowledgement that now pervaded every corner of the home. New letters continued to arrive sporadically. Each one brought additional accounts of cruelty, neglect, and betrayal. Moments that had been hidden beneath the guise of necessity, small acts that compounded into profound harm. The family could not ignore these truths. Pride, self-interest, and silence had preserved appearances, but the letters made clear the cost of such choices. Every reading deepened awareness, leaving no room for evasion or rationalization. Jonathan, Eleanor, and Samuel navigated their days under a subtle but constant tension. Conversations were quieter, glances more loaded, movements more deliberate. Clara noticed everything, asking questions she did not yet understand fully. But the awareness in her small observations amplified the household's unease. The letters, meticulous in detail, forced the Halloways to see the cumulative consequences of their actions. The correspondence demanded nothing more than reflection. There were no threats, no accusations framed with malice. Each letter was a record, an unflinching mirror of past choices. Pride, cruelty, and avoidance were exposed in stark clarity, leaving the family to confront their decisions and their impact on Thomas Reed. Jonathan and Eleanor could no longer hide behind memory. Samuel could not ignore the weight of understanding now present, and Clara sensed that something irrevocable had entered their lives. The letters, arriving unannounced, had become a presence within the house. Every corner seemed charged with the history they revealed. Daily life was interrupted. Tasks were imbued with reflection, and silence carried meaning. Each family member confronted acts that had once seemed necessary but were now undeniable in their cruelty. The careful, deliberate detailing of Thomas's experiences forced acknowledgement, leaving the Halloways aware of every failure and every choice that had caused suffering. Even routine moments, meals, chores, conversations became examinations of conscience. Eleanor, Jonathan, and Samuel found that the weight of observation was constant, unyielding and impossible to dismiss. Clara, sensing the tension, observed quietly, learning more about the subtleties of human behavior and the consequences of inaction than she could have imagined. The letters' influence persisted like a quiet, relentless presence. They revealed moments of neglect and abuse, demanded recognition, and exposed the moral cost of the family's choices. Pride, silence, and self-preservation could not shield them from the scrutiny now, imposed by Thomas Reed's words. Each envelope brought clarity, forcing reflection and moral reckoning that could not be avoided or ignored. Another letter arrived quietly, almost as if it had materialized from nowhere. Eleanor picked it up with shaking hands, her chest tight with a mix of fear and anticipation. Jonathan's face was rigid, eyes narrowing as he unfolded the envelope with deliberate care. Samuel hovered nearby, curiosity and dread warring within him. Each letter from Thomas Reed had changed the rhythm of their days, but this one seemed heavier, sharper, as though it had been crafted to expose truths they had long tried to hide. The handwriting was familiar, precise, and unyielding. This letter did not recount the obvious cruelties or the daily indignities Thomas had endured. It focused on the subtler, quieter betrayals and the moments when neglect and self-interest had combined to isolate him completely. It described Eleanor and Jonathan's decisions in intimate detail, highlighting the choices that had seemed trivial at the time but had deep consequences. Thomas's words painted a portrait of neglect intertwined with pride, revealing how appearances had always been valued over compassion. Eleanor read aloud, voice steady but tinged with unease. Each sentence described small acts of cruelty, meals withheld until work was completed, chores assigned during illness, opportunities for kindness deliberately ignored. Jonathan flinched at the words, recalling incidents he had long rationalized, believing that discipline and reputation justified his decisions. Samuel listened intently, sensing a growing chasm between the family he knew and the reality revealed in the letters. The letter detailed episodes where Thomas had been subjected to social isolation, forced to endure scorn or suspicion from neighbors, all carefully orchestrated to protect the Halloways' reputation. It reminded them of whispered accusations that had damaged his standing, the deliberate neglect that had compounded his suffering, and the quiet triumphs of pride that had been mistaken for authority. Each description forced the family to confront the full scope of their actions, no longer able to dismiss them as minor errors or youthful indiscretions. Clara, who had been quietly observing, asked Eleanor a hesitant question. "Did he ever know we cared?" Eleanor's lips tightened, unsure of how to answer. There was no comfort to offer, no simple reassurance. The letters left no room for excuses or softened recollections. They demanded recognition of truth in its starkest form. Jonathan ran a hand over his face, memories flooding back, the silent glances exchanged with neighbors, the pride that had dictated harsh decisions, the ease with which he had chosen his own reputation over a young man's dignity. Eleanor felt the familiar churn of guilt in her stomach, recalling moments she had once rationalized as necessary for family survival, now revealed as contributions to Thomas's suffering. Samuel, despite his youth, began to understand the weight of moral responsibility and the cumulative impact of their choices. Another envelope appeared later that evening, placed on the table without fanfare. This one revealed details of Thomas's final days, the exhaustion and despair he had endured, and the silent witness of a family that had turned away. The letter described the mental and emotional toll of constant oversight mixed with neglect, emphasizing the subtle ways cruelty had been enacted. The Halloways were forced to recognize that even actions, taken with a sense of necessity, had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. The household moved in quiet tension. Every sound seemed amplified: the crackling of the fire, the shifting of chairs, the ticking of the clock, each a reminder that the letters were present, unyielding and deliberate. Eleanor found herself rereading passages repeatedly, attempting to understand the full depth of the moral failures described. Jonathan walked the halls slowly, revisiting spaces where Thomas had labored, memories colliding with written accounts to form an unshakable clarity. Samuel observed silently, the weight of awareness pressing on him, while Clara sensed a tension that even she could not name. The letters did not threaten, they did not demand retribution. They simply revealed, documenting every choice, every omission, every act of pride or neglect. They forced the family to face themselves, their intentions, their failures, and the consequences that had unfolded in ways they had ignored or denied. Jonathan and Eleanor could not dismiss these truths, and Samuel's understanding grew with each line he absorbed. Even Clara, in her quiet observations, sensed the household's irrevocable shift. New details in the letters highlighted not only past acts but the emotional landscapes they had created. Thomas had endured silent suffering, watching a family that could have intervened prioritize appearances over compassion. The meticulous accounts forced the Halloways to see the cumulative effect of choices that had once seemed insignificant. Pride, indifference, and self-interest had combined to create a lasting harm that could no longer be unseen. The family's routines were disrupted in subtle but profound ways. Conversations were shorter, eyes met with hesitation, and movements were measured, reflecting an unspoken awareness of the letter's scrutiny. Eleanor paused in her chores. Jonathan lingered in the corners of rooms, and Samuel approached tasks with a cautious understanding of responsibility. Clara noticed, absorbing the tension and learning, in ways she could not articulate, that actions and inaction carry consequences beyond immediate perception. The letter's presence permeated every corner of the home. They arrived unannounced, silent yet insistently influential. Each new revelation forced reflection and moral reckoning, leaving the Halloways no refuge from the past they had attempted to bury. Pride, cruelty, and avoidance were laid bare, forcing acknowledgement of the cumulative weight of choices. The family could not escape their scrutiny. Every gesture, every glance, every recollection became intertwined with the letter's revelations. They were forced to confront patterns of behavior previously rationalized, the slow, deliberate shaping of suffering they had enabled, and the consequences that rippled beyond what they had anticipated. The household itself seemed to carry the memory of these actions, rooms heavy with accountability, air dense with awareness. Through the relentless presence of the letters, the Halloways came to see themselves with unflinching clarity. They were no longer merely the guardians of a family legacy. They were witnesses to their own failings, tasked with understanding and confronting the cumulative cruelty they had enacted. And while Thomas Reed remained physically absent, his words filled the house, insistent, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. A faint knock at the door startled Eleanor. She froze, her hand stilling on the counter as if the air itself carried the weight of expectation. Jonathan's gaze followed hers, the tension in his shoulders betraying the unease that had settled in the house. Samuel peeked from behind the staircase railing, curious yet cautious. The envelope lying on the doorstep was unmistakable, the same careful, deliberate handwriting that had haunted them before. Eleanor retrieved it slowly, feeling the familiar chill of apprehension. She handed it to Jonathan without a word, both of them knowing that the contents would reveal something deeper this time, something more piercing than before. Samuel watched as Jonathan unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the lines with a rigid focus, his jaw tight. The words were different. They no longer simply recounted past acts of neglect or cruelty. This letter highlighted intentional manipulations, moments when Thomas had been deliberately isolated and pitted against circumstances designed to break his spirit. It described a series of choices the Halloways had made to maintain appearances while subtly eroding his sense of security and self-worth. Each sentence was precise, almost surgical, exposing the family's pride and control as instruments of suffering. Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had long feared that the smallest acts of indifference mattered little, but the letter revealed how each had compounded, creating invisible walls that trapped Thomas in loneliness and despair. Jonathan's eyes hardened. The familiar defensiveness he carried faltering under the relentless scrutiny of Thomas's words. Samuel's voice quivered as he read aloud fragments, each line forcing the household to confront the depth of the manipulation that had been disguised as necessity. Clara lingered at the doorway, absorbing the tension with a quiet understanding beyond her years. She noticed subtle shifts in the household, Eleanor's hands trembling slightly, Jonathan pacing the room as if seeking escape, and Samuel's face pale with the realization of cumulative wrongdoing. The letters had begun to reshape their perception of themselves, their decisions, and the consequences that had followed. The letter detailed a cruel game of appearances. Thomas had been guided to believe certain failures were his fault alone, while Eleanor and Jonathan orchestrated events to ensure their own reputations remained intact. Even minor acts of kindness had been withheld strategically, creating an environment where trust and hope eroded slowly. The Halloways were forced to confront the deliberate nature of their cruelty, recognizing that what they had long justified as discipline or order had been, in truth, calculated neglect. Another envelope arrived the next morning. Samuel hesitated before opening it, sensing the emotional weight it would carry. The letter recounted the subtle isolation Thomas had endured, the quiet discouragement, and the constant expectation of perfection that left him no room for error. The words drew vivid scenes, a garden left untended while Thomas labored without aid, meals skipped while he completed endless chores, quiet scorn masked as instruction. Every detail amplified the awareness that the family had systematically diminished a young man's life under the guise of propriety. Eleanor's voice shook as she read aloud. The family could no longer ignore that pride had dictated cruelty. That silence had reinforced suffering, and that deception had been maintained at the cost of a human life. Jonathan's hands trembled slightly, a rare vulnerability surfacing as he recalled moments he had previously dismissed. Samuel's eyes darted between his parents and the letter, understanding now that moral reckoning was unavoidable. Clara's small frame seemed to absorb the weight of their guilt, the tension settling over her as if she too bore witness to the unspoken truths of the past. The letters revealed not just the past, but the impact of secrecy. Thomas had endured both visible and invisible hardships, many unknown even to the family. These letters exposed the complexity of cruelty, how omission, indifference, and subtle manipulation could cause profound harm. Each revelation chipped away at the household's sense of normalcy. Tasks once routine felt laden with consequence. Glances between family members carried unspoken admissions, and silence filled the spaces once occupied by ease and familiarity. A third envelope arrived later that day. Jonathan hesitated before opening it, the paper almost burning through the tension it carried. The letter described how Thomas's trust had been tested repeatedly, each test orchestrated to measure compliance and obedience, while the Halloway's satisfaction rested in his perceived failure or endurance. The words detailed the emotional landscape of control and intimidation, documenting how small, deliberate choices had cumulatively inflicted profound suffering. Eleanor read passages aloud, her voice soft but steady. The household fell silent, the air thick with reflection and unease. Samuel's curiosity now mingled with fear, as he realized the extent to which decisions meant to protect their reputation had destroyed hope. Clara, sensing the intensity, asked no questions this time, but her eyes held a quiet awareness that mirrored the gravity within the room. The letters did not accuse. They did not demand retribution. They catalogued with unwavering precision the ripple effects of pride, neglect, and cruelty. They forced the Halloways to confront the subtle ways in which Their desire for control had undermined trust, compassion, and moral clarity. Each line left them unsettled, unable to return to ordinary routines without the shadow of accountability lingering in every action and thought. The household grew tense in new ways. Meals were taken quietly, conversations trimmed to avoid unnecessary words, and routine tasks carried a weight of reflection. Eleanor found herself pausing mid-action, compelled to reread lines that revealed the consequences of her choices. Jonathan moved slowly, revisiting corners of the house where Thomas had labored, seeing with unflinching clarity the environment he had helped create. Samuel absorbed details with a mix of horror and understanding, grappling with the implications of inherited responsibility. Even Clara, though young, internalized the tension, her awareness sharpening as the atmosphere of moral reckoning deepened. New revelations surfaced in each subsequent letter, exposing previously hidden acts of neglect and cruelty. Subtle manipulations, unspoken expectations, and deliberate isolation were catalogued with unwavering accuracy. The Halloways could no longer dismiss the past as inconsequential. Every action, every omission, every choice carried weight, and the letters ensured that nothing remained hidden. Jonathan and Eleanor faced one another in silence, the enormity of their deeds pressing upon them without respite. Samuel lingered nearby, understanding that acknowledgement alone could not erase the cumulative impact of pride and indifference. Clara, observing quietly, sensed the change in the household, the slow unraveling of innocence, and the inescapable presence of accountability that now filled the walls of their home. The letters' influence was relentless. They arrived without warning, each one more revealing than the last. They exposed the intricate network of decisions and omissions that had shaped Thomas Reed's life and death, making clear that moral reckoning could not be delayed or ignored. Pride, cruelty, and self-preservation were laid bare, and the family had no choice but to confront the full weight of their past actions. Even routine interactions became examinations of conscience. Every glance, every hesitation, every silent pause carried the unspoken reminder that their choices had consequences far beyond immediate perception. The Halloways were forced to see themselves as Thomas Reed had seen them, flawed, fallible and accountable, and to reckon with truths they had long avoided. The morning was heavy with an almost tangible tension. No letter had arrived overnight, but the Halloways felt its absence as sharply as if it had been delivered. Eleanor moved through the kitchen silently, her hands lingering over the dishes as though the mundane task might steady her thoughts. Jonathan lingered in the hallway, staring at the walls as if they themselves were whispering the memories the letters had dredged up. Samuel sat at the table, restless, glancing at every creak and shadow, aware that the past had become a living presence in their home. It was Samuel who noticed the envelope first, wedged beneath the rug by the door. He hesitated before picking it up, sensing that this letter would be unlike any before. Its edges were neat, the handwriting deliberate, yet the tone carried a subtle sharpness, a precision that hinted at truths they had not yet confronted. Jonathan and Eleanor gathered quickly, eyes fixed on the envelope, understanding instinctively that another revelation awaited them. The letter began by recounting incidents that had remained hidden, even from their own memories. Small betrayals, unnoticed or deliberately ignored, were now laid bare. It spoke of Eleanor's decisions to withhold guidance at crucial moments, of Jonathan's insistence on appearances over empathy, and of the subtle ways both had allowed Thomas to struggle in isolation. Each line revealed patterns, not isolated acts, patterns of control, pride and silent cruelty. Eleanor read aloud, her voice steady but soft, as though the weight of the words required measured speech. The letter did not dramatize or accuse. It documented, and in its precision, it pierced their consciousness with an intensity that left them breathless. Jonathan's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white as memories he had buried resurfaced. Samuel listened, absorbing not only the content but the moral clarity it demanded. Clara lingered quietly, watching the tension unfold with a dawning comprehension that grew heavier with each sentence. This letter went further than previous ones. It detailed moments when Thomas had been forced into choices designed to humiliate or challenge him unjustly. It highlighted Eleanor and Jonathan's attempts to manipulate outcomes for their own advantage, the small acts that compounded into significant psychological strain. Each revelation left no room for rationalization. The family could no longer hide behind excuses or selective memory. The consequences of their pride and neglect were now unavoidable and precise. Another passage described subtle betrayals that occurred even when no one else was present. Thomas had been subjected to silent disapproval, withheld aid and moments of isolation, orchestrated for the Halloways' comfort rather than his well-being. The letter explained how these choices, small in isolation, had formed a lattice of psychological pressure, shaping his behavior and responses in ways the family had neither intended nor considered, but were nonetheless responsible for. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained controlled. The realization that her decisions had contributed to this suffering in such insidious ways struck her with full force. Jonathan's face remained taut with tension, yet beneath the surface, an unfamiliar vulnerability emerged. Samuel's brow furrowed. He began to see the interconnectedness of past acts and the enduring consequences they carried. Even Clara, quiet but attentive, sensed that the household had crossed a threshold. That innocence had been irrevocably altered. Later that day, a new envelope arrived, this one heavier, the paper thicker. Jonathan hesitated before opening it, sensing that its content might reveal not only the Halloways' past actions, but their character in ways they had yet to confront. The letter recounted Thomas's observations of their interactions, of the subtle tensions that had marked the household, the avoidance of eye contact, the restrained conversations, the unspoken rules imposed to maintain control and superiority. The writing was meticulous, yet in its precision lay a cruelty of its own. The letter forced the family to see themselves as they had appeared to Thomas, to confront the starkness of their neglect and manipulation. Eleanor read aloud, voice even but trembling slightly. The passages described not only failures of care, but the erosion of trust, the slow decay of relationship, and the insidious effects of pride unchecked. Samuel's voice caught as he read a particularly revealing section, one that described Eleanor and Jonathan's attempts to control Thomas's actions through fear and omission. It detailed how subtle manipulations, things that had seemed trivial, had left him feeling powerless, isolated and unworthy. The precision of the letter left no room for defense. Each line demanded acknowledgement, reflection, and understanding. Clara, observing silently, began to ask questions softly, probing the gaps she sensed in their explanations. Eleanor and Jonathan could provide no easy answers. The letters had rendered excuses irrelevant. They revealed patterns of thought and behavior that had been invisible to casual observation but devastating in their cumulative effect. The family felt as though they were living under the scrutiny of an unseen presence. Thomas Reed's careful attention, making each act and thought measurable, accountable. Another envelope arrived that evening, yet another layer of truth. It recounted the emotional consequences of neglect, Thomas's anxiety, fear and quiet despair in response to the Halloways' choices. The letter explained that cruelty is not only in overt acts, but in omission, in the silent prioritization of self-interest over empathy. Eleanor's shoulders slumped under the weight of the realization. Jonathan remained rigid, yet his eyes betrayed the growing awareness of the depth of their impact. Samuel, though younger, understood in stark clarity that the patterns he had witnessed were deliberate and damaging. The letters, in their unflinching documentation, began to fracture the household in subtle ways. Conversations were shorter, glances more loaded, and every movement was accompanied by an unspoken recognition of moral accountability. Eleanor and Jonathan no longer interacted with the ease of routine. Samuel's presence became a mirror for awareness, and Clara absorbed the tension, internalizing lessons she could not yet articulate. Each envelope that arrived introduced new elements of reflection and unease. Some letters recounted moments of humiliation that Thomas had endured. Others revealed choices that had forced him into hardship unnecessarily. The precision of the writing ensured that the family could not escape the reality they had long denied. Their pride, their neglect, and their desire to control had shaped another life in profound, often devastating ways. Jonathan and Eleanor were no longer merely guardians of reputation. They had become witnesses to the consequences of their actions. Samuel, in observing the letters and the household's response, understood that moral responsibility extended beyond intention, into the realm of effect. Clara, quietly absorbing the tension, sensed the weight of accountability that now permeated every corner of the home. The letters did not shout or demand, they revealed. They exposed, illuminated, and forced reflection. Pride, cruelty, and neglect were laid bare. The Halloways could not evade them. Their choices, once rationalized and buried beneath time, now demanded full recognition and understanding. Each envelope deepened the family's awareness, leaving them haunted, reflective, and irrevocably changed. The house was quiet but not peaceful. Silence had settled like a heavy fog, pressing into every corner and filling every room with tension. Eleanor moved slowly through the kitchen, her movements careful, almost ritualistic, as if fearing that any abrupt motion might awaken the memories the letters had conjured. Jonathan lingered by the staircase, shoulders tense, eyes tracing the shadows, as if they might reveal some truth still hidden. Samuel sat at the table, hands folded, absorbing the charged atmosphere, while Clara's small figure hovered near the doorway, watching, listening, learning without words. The morning brought another envelope, but this one was different. Its paper was thicker, the edges crisp, the writing precise and deliberate as always. But there was a weight to it that felt heavier than the rest. Eleanor hesitated before touching it, feeling a chill that was not from the cold, but from anticipation. Jonathan reached for it simultaneously, and they exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken understanding. Whatever this letter contained, it would leave no comfort, no room for denial. Samuel watched as Jonathan unfolded it, eyes narrowing as he read. The letter did not recount minor slights or overlooked responsibilities. It recounted decisions made with intention. The ways Eleanor and Jonathan had prioritized pride, reputation, and convenience over Thomas's well-being. The descriptions were meticulous, almost surgical, revealing how carefully the family had constructed a life in which Thomas's suffering was tolerated, minimized, or hidden. Eleanor's voice trembled as she read aloud. The letter described moments of manipulation, not physical but psychological, the silent punishments, the expectations designed to instill fear or compliance, and the subtle ways the household's hierarchy had been maintained at Thomas's expense. Each sentence forced recognition of acts they had previously justified, normalized, or ignored. Jonathan's jaw tightened, and Samuel's young face betrayed a dawning awareness of the depth of moral failure he was witnessing. Clara, who had been silently observing, sensed the shift in the house. There was a new intensity to the tension, a suffocating weight that pressed against her chest. She had seen her parents' pride and fear, but this letter unveiled the consequences in full, the culmination of neglect, control, and indifference. Even she could sense the gravity of the words, the moral reckoning they demanded. The letter went further, describing Thomas's final days and the emotional and mental toll of living under calculated indifference. It revealed how isolation, repeated humiliation, and the withholding of kindness had shaped his experience, leaving scars that were invisible but profound. Every detail forced Eleanor and Jonathan to see themselves not as caretakers or providers, but as architects of suffering. Samuel read a portion aloud, his voice quivering. The passages recounted moments of subtle betrayal, opportunities for intervention that were ignored, kindnesses withheld for the sake of appearances, and actions taken to assert control or maintain pride. The precision of the writing made it impossible to deny or excuse. Each line left the family confronted with the full measure of their choices. For the first time, Jonathan spoke aloud, his voice heavy with remorse. We thought we were doing what was best. We never—" he faltered, unable to finish. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, tears brimming in her eyes. Samuel sat in silence, understanding that words alone could not undo what had been done. Clara remained still, absorbing the weight of these admissions, her young mind grappling with the intensity of accountability. Another letter arrived in the evening. This one detailed interpersonal betrayals within the household and the small arguments avoided, the silences maintained, the unspoken tensions that had contributed to Thomas's sense of isolation. Each paragraph revealed layers of neglect, showing how the family's internal dynamics had created a web that trapped him, emotionally, socially, and psychologically. Eleanor read aloud, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. The letters forced the Halloways to face the reality of their behavior, the compounded effects of small, deliberate choices made to preserve pride, reputation, or control. Jonathan, too, felt the sharp clarity of accountability pressing into him, and Samuel's understanding deepened, the young man realizing that morality is measured not by intention alone but by consequence. The household was transformed. Everyday interactions were filtered through awareness and guilt. Each gesture carried weight, each glance held significance. Meals were quiet, the air thick with reflection and unspoken remorse. Even the smallest actions, folding laundry, tending the hearth, arranging the garden, were now imbued with recognition of past failings. Clara, sensing this transformation, understood that the weight of history and consequence was now inseparable from their daily lives. The letters had done more than reveal past cruelty. They had created a moral reckoning that permeated every corner of the home. Pride, silence, and self-interest had given way to reflection, accountability, and sorrow. Jonathan and Eleanor could not escape the truths laid bare. Samuel could not ignore the impact of observation and moral responsibility. And Clara absorbed the household's changed rhythm as a silent witness. Even in the quiet moments, the family felt the weight of Thomas Reed's presence, not in person, but through the meticulous accounts he had left behind. Each word a reminder of suffering endured, each passage a reflection of cruelty and neglect, each envelope a demand for awareness and understanding. The letters had reshaped the household, leaving them inescapably aware of their own imperfections and the consequences of pride and control. By the end of the day, the Halloways understood that the letters were more than correspondence. They were a mirror that reflected not only past actions, but the moral truth of their effects, forcing recognition, reflection, and a lifelong awareness that would remain long after the envelopes had ceased to arrive. Eleanor, Jonathan, Samuel, and even Clara could no longer inhabit the house in ignorance. Every action, glance, and word carried the shadow of accountability Thomas Reed's meticulous words had left behind. In the heavy stillness of the evening, the family gathered together silently, no one speaking. The letters had done their work. They had stripped away excuses, revealed the depth of negligence and cruelty, and left a household confronted with the full measure of its own choices. Pride, indifference, and secrecy had been unmasked, leaving only reflection, remorse, and an understanding that the past, though buried, was inescapable.